Well, and I don't know if you remember, I had you on the show before to discuss pseudophysics. This is when I only read about that much of the book. Um, I really want to get into to what you just said about the basically the fact that there's a short side really turns us into a moral question. But before we do that, can we go into the history of labor a little bit? Because you said you basically start with the Medicis, but you kind of start with Rome in the book, where Christianity is basically the first thing on the face of the planet that takes a look at labor differently from everyone else, right? Can you give a little bit of an idea of how labor was valued before Christianity and how Christianity gave that a facelift?
Okay,
to
it was
give it a
the
euphemism?
short answer is it was not valued at all. If you look at the great Greek philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, you had a country basically that had people who exploited labor so that they could be philosophers. They were called helots. They had to do all the work. Someone once said that if you wanted, you couldn't be a citizen of Athens if you had to have a job, because it was a full-time job just to have all those discussions and all those meetings to determine policy. So you had a kind of Platonic dualism that was based on the realm of forms and the realm of matter. And if you wanted to be a philosopher and deal with the realm of forms, you couldn't work. And if
slaves.
you wanted, and so if you're not going to work, you have to have slaves. So this is a culture, no matter how one of the greatest outburst of logos in human history, but it was based on contempt for human labor. That was something that was done by slaves. Now, this could not survive the advent of Christianity, because now the human person has a much higher value, and there's no great dichotomy here between free man and slave. There was in Athens. Aristotle debated whether you are a slave by nature. Phusei? Are some people condemned to be slaves by their very nature? We went through this in the American South, where black folk were supposed to be created by God to tote that bale and lift that barge, But this is not compatible with Christianity. And so you have the advent of Christianity in Rome, the Roman Empire, at a time when you again had contempt for labor. And the sign you have contempt for labor is the slave society. And the slave society comes about through usury. It's that simple. You cannot talk about labor and usury without, there are two sides of the same coin. And so what you had in the Roman Republic were gentlemen farmers. This is what Virginia was supposed to breed, gentlemen farmers, the people that put, like George Washington, put down the plow and picked up a gun and drove the English out. Those people in the Roman Republic had to buy their own weapons, and they fought wars at their own expense. And when the wars got to expand to the Roman Empire, they lost everything because they couldn't afford to do this. And when you lose everything, you got to work for someone else. And at that time, that meant being a slave on one of the latifundia, which were the factory farms of the Roman Empire. And so what you created, because of usury, because you didn't have a Christian understanding of the nature of value, was a slave society at the bottom and a usury society at the top. And that wrecked the empire. It wrecked the empire. You cannot have usury because you can never pay off the debt. And so what the Roman Empire did was, well, we'll plunder other countries and we'll kick the debt down the road. You can only do that for a certain time.
Right.
And
you
then
expand
the bill comes due.
Yeah.
The bill comes due, and when 476, when Romulus is can't pay the troops, and damn well the first thing that happens when you don't pay the troops is that they loot your country. And that's exactly what happened with the Germanic invasion. My barbarian ancestors.
Well, it's fascinating you point that out. One of the topics we've talked about on the show is specifically that the relationship between debt and slavery. And I just to emphasize what you're talking about, like, I'm sure this goes back even further. It's just that Sumeria they wrote the best records, and all the records they wrote were about taxes on stone, so they're there for us to read, right? But this was like a constant issue, even in ancient Sumeria, where due to usury, at some point, so much of the population would become slaves that they regularly had to do these debt jubilees. Otherwise, the society would crumble because the whole
Right.
the whole place
Right.
turned into slaves.
The Hebrews had that in their scripture.
Right.
Because they were inspired by God, and God knew you can't have a floating loan forever.
Right.
It's going to wreck everything. You can have a floating loan for 60 years and then it's going to explode and no one can pay it off. And that'll be the end of it. So you have to have a jubilee year. You have to forgive debt. It's that simple. And we're totally confused about that because we basically have a pagan concept called pacta sunt servanda. In other words, if you sign the contract, you're on the hook and you're going to pay. That's the what rules student loans right now.
Correct. Yes. Thank you for bringing that up. Yep.
Students can't renege on their debts. Only the rich and the powerful. Donald Trump did it 3 times. Okay, because he's too big to fail. But the poor schmuck who took out a student loan, oh no, you're on the hook, buddy.
Oh yeah,
and you're never going to get out of it.
If I create an entity and know how to play the credit game, like I create an LLC, I sign up on the right websites, I get the right credit accounts, I get a thing where I can loan $100,000, I loan $100,000, I pay myself, don't pay it off, that thing goes bankrupt. Right? That's the entity. If I know how to play the stupid game with the way that the rules are set up, I can totally take advantage of it. But like you said, if I want to follow, just be a good guy that does labor and learns, I get screwed.
That's right.
It's insane.
That's right. Donald Trump said exactly the same thing. He said you will get he knew how to game the system, and that's why he became too big to fail. But debt is essentially unrepayable. The whole point of this, what is economics? Economics is not some magic formula that will allow Donald Trump to get rich. If you're talking about an individual, you're really not talking about economics. Mm-hmm. Economics is the big picture. And once you look at debt over with the perspective of the big picture, you realize it's untenable. And I think that this is exactly what Christianity understood at the beginning of that era. Just as they understood that there is value to human labor, they understood that usury is a sin. And you can't allow it. And it worked because the Roman Empire collapsed. You have a situation where there's only local economies. And there's really not a whole big role that money plays in a local economy like this after the collapse of the Roman Empire. So the serf comes into existence. The serf, this is a period of time when you're constantly being plagued by invasions. It's the Vikings from the north. It's the Saracens from the south. When the Vikings show up and you're just this little guy with a little plot of land, you have to run to the castle and you have to wait it out, hope that they just go away. And then you go back and hope they didn't wreck your crops. And it became so chronic that they said, look, I can't do this anymore. I have to become basically a servant to the Lord because he's got the castle. And that was the beginning of the serf system. Now you owed the Lord labor.
Taxes were in labor at that point.
You were saying you owed him labor and you didn't need money. That was the good part of it because you didn't have to get money to pay taxes. You paid taxes by giving the Lord labor. And over that period of time, we had the Christianity being the leaven in the loaf. And so at a certain point, because the serf had rights as a Christian, we're all children of God, we're all on the same level. He began to have de facto property rights of this German sort, which meant you had the right to work this property, but you did not have the right to sell it. And that's an important distinction. So gradually that became institutionalized and you pretty much had the right. This is in England as well. You had the right to use that property even though you didn't own it. And there were people, a rich man would die and he'd create a purgatory society, which is basically you could graze your sheep here if you pray for my soul. Mm-hmm. And it was one of these beautiful arrangements that William Cobbett talks about in his book on the Reformation in England.